Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. When the California Prune Board realized the words prune and laxative were inextricably linked, they switched to dried plums in the year 2000. People bought it, and in a documented focus group, preferred the taste of dried plums to prunes. That's another of those little facts I found that point to the name of something being important. This week we are working at things the other way around by focusing on several people mentioned in the Bible story who all shared the name Joseph. Today we want to consider Joseph of Arimathea. Now let's start our consideration of him by first talking about how people were buried in Israel then. Surely some were buried much like we bury people today, but some areas are very rocky terrain, and digging a hole was not always possible. So in many cases there were caves and bodies that would be placed in the cave on a niche that has been carved from the rock for that purpose. When I was living in Israel about 25 years ago, not living in Israel, let's try that again. When I was in Israel about 25 years ago, we visited some caves that were made just like that. Most of them had niches for several people in one cave. And in fact, after corpses had rotted away, the niches could be reused for those who were newly dead. The Gospels make the clear point that Joseph was a wealthy man and had had this cave prepared for his own death. Therefore it was a new cave and had never been used before. Perhaps that shows special honor for the body of Jesus. Now let's talk a little bit about what we can know about Joseph of Arimathea personally. First, it is clear that he was from the town of Arimathea. The problem is that while the name has been associated with a few towns, we really don't have any idea where Arimathea was in those days. While one gospel says simply that he was a wealthy man, the others say that Joseph was a member of the council, also known as the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was one of the governing bodies in Israel. To be sure, Israel was governed by the Romans, who were ultimately in charge, but in order to keep the peace, when Rome conquered a land, they often kept the local government in place. Those local governments were puppet regimes to the Romans, but not throwing out the traditional forms of government helped smooth the way for the people. The job of the Sanhedrin was to advise the Roman government about Jewish traditions and customs, but also to make decisions on religious matters that came up. The Romans really didn't want to get involved in religious disputes, so they left that to the Sanhedrin. As you might expect, the Sanhedrin was made up of some of the leaders and elite in society. Among its members you would find the chief priests and Sadducees, other prominent Pharisees, and wealthy individuals. We know several members of the Sanhedrin in the time of Jesus by name. Caiaphas was the high priest, so he was certainly there. In Acts, another man named Gamaliel is mentioned, and in the Gospels, both Joseph and Nicodemus are named. You can see that the Sanhedrin in action in how when Jesus was arrested, it was deemed a religious matter, and so he was taken to the Sanhedrin for questioning and judgment. He was found guilty of blasphemy, and they wanted to have him killed, but they didn't have the authority to do that, so they took him to Pilate. The Romans had to give permission for an execution. One of the Gospels describes Joseph as a member of the Sanhedrin, but also a secret follower of Jesus. It is also interesting that one of the Gospels goes into greater detail about the burial of Jesus, how Joseph asked Pilate for the body and then bought a new linen shroud to wrap the body, and how Nicodemus, another member of the Sanhedrin, who had a nighttime conversation with Jesus about faith and being born again, helped Joseph bury Jesus with about 100 pounds of spices. Nicodemus was part of the Sanhedrin. Was he a follower of Jesus as well? We don't know. As brief as the story of Joseph of Arimathea is, there are some things we can learn from him. Joseph of Arimathea's actions remind us of the importance of bold faith and standing up for what is right, even when it's not popular or safe. His willingness to serve Jesus, even after his death, is an example of bold faith and sacrificial love. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.